Well, you're scared to talk. He grinned, looking for an audience. Damn, this place is quiet. Feels like a funeral in here. No one laughed. Something about that only irritated him more. His attention flicked back to Jack's. He took another step closer. His boots stopping just a few feet away from the dog. Damon finally set his coffee down. Slow, controlled. Jax didn't move, but Damon could see the tension in his posture. He knew his dog, knew the way his muscles tightened just before a lunge. The way his breathing changed when he was waiting for a command. Careful, Damon said, his voice calm but firm. He doesn't like people in his space. The biker scoffed at that. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he raised his boot and kicked Jax hard. The impact center jolted through the dog's body. Jax yelped, stumbling back before regaining his stance. His eyes locking onto the man with razor-sharp focus. A collective gasp rippled through the cafe. Chairs scraped against the floor as people shifted, uncertain whether they should intervene or stay out of it. The biker chuckled, shaking his head like it was all just a joke. Shouldn't let him lay around like that. He muttered. Damon wasn't looking at him anymore. He was looking at Jack. The dog wasn't whimpering, wasn't cowering. He was waiting for Damon to say something. Waiting for permission. Damon exhaled slowly. A deep, controlled breath. Then, without looking away from Jack, he spoke. You got about 5 seconds to apologize. The biker snorted. Or what? Damon finally looked up. And for the first time, the biker saw it, the shift. The stillness that wasn't hesitation. It was calculation. The calm that didn't mean surrender, but control. A flicker of something passed through the biker's eyes. Confusion. Uncertainty. But it was too late for that now. Because this was the moment he realized he'd just made the worst mistake of his day. Wyatt Grayson had spent most of his life getting away with things. His size. His attitude. The way he carried himself. Most people weren't willing to push back. He was used to seeing fear in people's eyes. The way they shifted uncomfortably. The way they chose silence over confrontation. But Damon wasn't shifting. Wasn't flinching. And that was the first sign that things weren't going to play out the way Wyatt expected. The second was Jack. The dog hadn't moved an inch. But his eyes told a different story. Alert. Focused. The kind of look Wyatt had seen in guard dogs. Trained to rip a man apart with a single command. Wyatt scoffed, rolling his shoulders like he was shaking something off. You serious? He asked, tilting his head over a dog. Damon's expression didn't change. He just rested his hands flat on the table, fingers spread, relaxed. 5 seconds, he repeated, his voice calm. That's all you get? Wyatt chuckled dryly, glancing at the others in the cafe. You all hear this? This man's giving me a damn countdown. Nobody laughed. Nobody said a word. That's when Wyatt started to feel it. Not fear. Not yet. But something was off. His usual tricks weren't working. Damon wasn't reacting the way most men did. He wasn't puffing out his chest. Wasn't raising his voice. Wasn't throwing empty threats. And that silence, that lack of fear, it was worse than being yelled at. Wyatt's jaw tightened. What? You think you're some kind of badass? Damon didn't answer. 4 seconds. Wyatt let out a slow breath, cracking his knuckles. I don't apologize, he said, his voice dropping lower. Damon still didn't move. Didn't blink. 3 seconds. A bead of sweat rolled down the back of Wyatt's neck. He could feel something shifting in the room, not just with Damon. With everyone. The barista, the old couple by the window, the guy pretending to read a book. All of them were waiting for something. Like they already knew how this was going to end. 2 seconds. Wyatt's fingers curled into fists. You don't know who you're messing with, he muttered, stepping forward. 1 second. Damon sighed. Then he stood up. It was a slow, deliberate movement, nothing flashy, nothing rushed, but somehow, when he straightened to his full height, the air in the cafe changed. Wyatt wasn't small. He wasn't weak, but suddenly, for the first time in a long time, he felt small. Damon's gaze locked onto his, calm, steady, unwavering, and in that moment, Wyatt understood he had miscalculated badly. You were saying? Damon asked, His voice smooth as glass. Wyatt's throat felt tight. His mouth went dry, but he couldn't back down now. Not in front of everyone. So, he did what he always did. He swung first, and that's when everything went to hell. Because Wyatt had no idea who he was swinging at, Wyatt's fist cut through the air. Aimed straight at Damon's jaw. It was a strong punch. One that had put men on the ground before. But Damon wasn't most men with a slight pivot. He shifted his weight, dodging the strike with practiced ease. Wyatt's knuckles barely brushed past his face before Damon's hand shot up, catching the biker's wrist in a firm grip, and that's when Wyatt realized he was in trouble. Damon twisted Wyatt's arm just enough to make him stumble forward, his balance thrown off completely. Before he could react, Damon's other hand pressed against his shoulder, guiding him downward with controlled force. Wyatt's knee hit the floor with a dull thud. The cafe was dead silent. No one moved, no one spoke. Jack stood beside Damon, completely still, watching, waiting. Wyatt gritted his teeth, struggling to yank his arm free. But Damon's grip was unshakable, firm, controlled, but not excessive. He wasn't trying to break anything. Not yet. You're strong, Damon said quietly, but strength without control. He let that hang in the air for a second before continuing. That's just a wrecking ball waiting to crash into the wrong wall. Wyatt let out a frustrated grunt, twisting again. But Damon didn't budge. You don't want to do this, Damon continued. His voice was level, steady, not a warning. A fact. Wyatt's breathing was heavy now, chest rising and falling. His face was turning red, not just from exertion, but from humiliation. The man who had walked in expecting to intimidate everyone was now kneeling on the ground, pinned by someone who hadn't even broken a sweat. Damon released his grip, yanked his arm back, and stood quickly, rubbing his wrist as if he had just touched fire. He took a step back, then another. His eyes darted around the cafe, looking for support, a way out of this without losing face. No one moved, no one was on his side. And the worst part, Damon wasn't even looking at him anymore. He was reaching down, scratching Jack's behind the ears, as if Wyatt wasn't even worth his attention. That stung more than the takedown. Wyatt swallowed hard, his hands still clenched into fists. His mind screamed at him to do something, to throw another punch, to take back control of the situation. But something deeper, something primal, told him he had already lost. Damon finally looked up, his expression unreadable. That was your free pass, he said. Wyatt hesitated. What? Damon took a step closer, not aggressive, not threatening, just a presence. I don't know what kind of life you've lived, Damon said, but I do know this. You walk around looking for fights. One day you'll find one you can't win. Wyatt's jaw tensed. He didn't respond. Damon didn't expect him to. Next time you think about hurting something weaker than you. Damon's voice lowered just slightly, just enough to make Wyatt's stomach knot. Remember this moment? Wyatt opened his mouth, then shut it again. There was nothing to say. He turned abruptly and stormed out of the cafe, his heavy boots echoing against the tile. The door swung shut behind him with a final clunk. Silence followed. Then slowly, the cafe started breathing again. Chairs shifted. A few quiet murmurs rippled through the crowd. Someone behind the counter let out a shaky breath. Damon sat back down, picked up his coffee, and took a slow sip. Jack, sensing the moment was over, curled up at his feet again, and just like that, everything was normal except it wasn't. Because Wyatt Grayson had just learned a lesson he wouldn't forget. Wyatt stepped out of the cafe, but his mind was still inside. His chest heaved, his pulse hammering in his ears. The sun felt too hot, the air too thick. He had never been handled like that before. People had always backed down, always looked away, always let him be the biggest presence in the room. But Damon Mercer, Damon had barely lifted a finger. Wyatt's fists clenched at his sides as he made his way toward his bike, parked just a few feet away. His hands shook, not from pain, not even from rage. It was something else, something uncomfortable, something he didn't want to name. He grabbed his helmet, yanking it over his head with more force than necessary. His fingers hovered over the ignition, but he didn't start the engine. Instead, He stared at his own reflection in the side mirror, the same face he had seen for years. But something was different. He could still feel Damon's grip, the way it wasn't about overpowering him, but controlling the situation, the way he had taken Wyatt's wired strength and made it meaningless. And Jack, the damn dog, had been ready. Not scared, not panicked, just waiting. Wyatt exhaled sharply and looked over his shoulder through the cafe window. He could still see Damon, calm as ever, sipping his coffee. Like nothing had happened. Jack's curled up at his feet, relaxed. Like it was all routine. Like Wyatt hadn't even been a challenge. His stomach twisted. What was he supposed to do with that? He'd spent years being the guy people feared, the guy nobody messed with. The guy who could walk into a place and own it, but today he'd been dismissed, and that was worse than losing a fight. Wyatt clenched his jaw and turned the key in the ignition. The motorcycle rumbled to life beneath him, but it didn't feel like it usually did. It didn't drown out the thoughts, didn't silence the questions, didn't erase the way he'd been put in his place. With one last glance at the cafe, he pulled out onto the road. He didn't know where he was going, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. Back inside, the air was different. People had moved on, but not really. The tension had settled, like dust after a storm. A few customers threw Damon quick glances, grateful, impressed, maybe even a little in awe. He ignored them. He wasn't looking for attention. Reaching down, he gave Jax a firm scratch behind the ears. The dog sighed contentedly, resting his head on Damon's boot. "Good boy," Damon murmured. Jax had known. He'd felt it before anyone else. And Wyatt had walked in thinking he owned the place, but respect isn't something you take. It's something you earn. The barista hovered near his table. Damon looked up, and she swallowed, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of her apron. That was. She trailed off, searching for the words. Damon just gave her a small nod. "It's over." She let out a breath, nodded back, and returned to the counter. The truth was, it wasn't over. Not really, because guys like Wyatt, they either learn from moments like this, or they let the bitterness fester. Damon had seen it go both ways, but that wasn't his problem. Not anymore. He took another sip of coffee. Outside, the sun had shifted. The day moved forward, like it always did. Jax sighed in his sleep, and Damon let the moment pass, because at the end of the day, some lessons only sink in when the world stops handing out second chances. The hum of the cafe returned to normal, but Damon didn't say anything, didn't have to. Wyatt exhaled, looking down at his hands, fingers gripping the handlebars like he wasn't sure what to do with them. He swallowed, then shook his head, almost like he was frustrated with himself. Finally, he swung one leg off the bike and stood. His steps weren't heavy this time, no boots stomping, no forced presence. He stopped a few feet away, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, man," he hesitated, then let out a breath. "That day at the cafe, I was an ass." Damon studied him, saying nothing. Wyatt shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. I don't got a good excuse for it," he said, gesturing vaguely at the air, like he was waving at something no one else could see. "Been pissed off at the world for a long time. Just never had anyone check me on it before." Damon finally spoke. "And now?" Wyatt let out a small chuckle. "I guess I needed it." He kicked to the dirt, shaking his head. "That day messed me up. Couldn't stop thinking about it. Was ready to get back at you somehow. Then I looked in the damn mirror and—" His voice trailed off. Damon gave a slight nod. "And you didn't like what you saw?" Wyatt's jaw clenched, but he nodded. "Yeah." Silence stretched between them. Jack sat patiently at Damon's side, ears perked but relaxed, just watching. Finally, Wyatt sighed. "Anyway, I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For the dog. For being a piece of crap that day. Just, yeah." Damon let the words hang for a moment, then gave a single nod. "All right." Wyatt blinked. "That's it?" Damon shrugged. "What else do you want?" Wyatt let out a self-deprecating laugh. "I don't know, a punch to the face. Feels like I got off easy." Damon smirked. "I gave you something better." Wyatt tilted his head. "Yeah, what's that?" Damon's gaze was steady. "A second chance." Wyatt held that for a long moment. letting it sink in. Then, without another word, he turned, walked back to his bike, and pulled on his helmet. The engine growled to life. But before he rode off, he lifted a hand, not a wave, just an acknowledgement, and Damon, after a brief pause, gave him a nod in return. Wyatt pulled away. Disappearing into traffic, Damon looked down at Jack, who blinked up at him, tail thumping lazily against the ground. Guess people can change, Damon murmured. Jack huffed, like he wasn't so sure. Damon chuckled, then kept walking. Some people spend their whole lives running from the truth. But others, they stop, they face it, and sometimes, they actually do something about it. If this story made you think, even just for a second, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Maybe someone you know needs to hear this lesson too, because at the end of the day, we all get a second chance, but it's what we do with it that matters.